Hello everyone. In this tutorial, we'll be learning about cameras and lighting in 3D rendering. We will examine how to properly light a 3D modeled scene, we will learn terminology for camera movement, and we will also explore some general principles of rendering. Before you begin this tutorial, you should have a basic understanding of how to create objects and render in a 3D modeling program. When it comes to creating a 3D modeled scene, nothing is quite as effective or enriching as lighting and rendering effects. You can model a form very realistically in a beautiful way, but if your lighting and rendering techniques are lacking, your scene will come off as unappealing. Take, for example, these teddy bears here. On the left, we have an object that's modeled well, but the scene here is overall lacking. There's not very dynamic lighting, and the shadows are kind of dull. On the right-hand side, however, the teddy bear is illuminated in a very dynamic way. It is more visually appealing. The shadows are a lot richer, and it just appears to be a better scene overall. First, let us look at the proper way to illuminate a scene. We will be looking at the three-point lighting system. It is the most universal and well-known lighting system. Photographers, animators, painters, and so on all typically use the three-point lighting system. It is called such because there are three lights used in the system: the key light, the fill light, and the backlight. The key light is the primary light that shines directly on the object. The strength, color, and angle of light in a scene is determined by this key light. So you can see here in this image, the key light is a strong light and it's shining directly on the object here. The fill light, on the other hand, is a softer light. It also shines on the object, but typically at an angle. This light, its purpose is to soften out dark and harsh shadows. So you can see here in this image that the fill light is noticeably less intense than the key light. And last but not least is the backlight. It is called this because the light shines from behind the object. Because it is positioned behind the object, it helps to create a rim of light around the object so it does not blend into the background. Let's take a look at this interactive display here. It'll kind of help you visualize how these lights work a little better. So I'm going to start by turning off all of the lights. You can see here, by turning on the backlight, how there's just a rim of the figure. When we turn on the fill light, it's relatively soft. We can see the figure, but not very clearly. And if you turn on just the key light, she looks pretty well illuminated. However, she kind of blends into the background in some of the darker areas here, and there are harsh shadows here on her face. Watch as we turn all three lights on. See what a difference that fill light makes? And then when we turn on the backlight, she really pops out of the background here. By implementing the three-point lighting system, your scenes will provide you with a better overall rendered image. All right, it's time for our quick quiz number 1. Please take some time to look at the questions on the right side of this screen. Next, let's look at some cameras used for 3D rendering. Cameras present a scene from a particular point of view. Your 3D objects are created in a space that is not set to render unless you tell it where to look. Cameras do this for us. If you set up a camera in your scene, your program will use the virtual camera to look through and capture your scene in the way that you wish. In order to properly set up a camera and be able to move it about the scene, especially if you're animating, you will need to know the terminology that is used when moving a camera. Let's start with dolly. This is a term that means you move the camera farther or closer away to the object. This is different than zooming in because you're physically moving the camera either farther away or closer to the object. So if you look at this image, the camera would be moving either farther, like away from the image, or closer to the object. Next is pedestal. This term means to move the camera up and down as if it were on a pedestal, I guess you could say. It's fixed in one spot, and it would either raise up higher or sink down lower. Truck is another term for movement. This is when the camera moves left or right. The lens remains at the same angle and faces forward, so there is no tilt or movement of angle of any kind. It just physically moves either to the right or to the left. Pan. This is to pivot the camera on its pedestal, moving either left or right without moving from its base. So this is what changes the camera angle. Tilt. This is much like pan, where the camera is pivoted in one spot, but instead of moving left and right, it would move up or down. And roll. This is where the camera's base stays in the same place and the camera rolls on its side, either to the left or the right. So for example, if you were pointing a camera at someone and you rolled the camera, the footage on the film would appear to be rotated on its side. So the camera would be pivoted here and it would roll over. Your virtual camera is your best friend when you are setting up a scene. By familiarizing yourself with these movements, you can learn to manipulate and position the camera just right in your 3D modeling endeavors. All right, it's time for quick quiz number 2. Please refer to the right of the screen. Now let's talk about some basic rendering tips. In the last part of this tutorial, we'll cover these rendering tips here. Rendering can be very time consuming, so keep some of these tips in mind to help you with time management. My first tip that I have to offer would be to render to a sequence. If you are rendering a scene that has multiple frames, which would mean it's an animation, it is typically better to render to a sequence of images, such as JPEGs, TIFFs, etc., instead of rendering to a video file type, like AVI or MOV. Sometimes things can happen and your computer shuts off during a storm or your laptop battery dies. If this happens while you're rendering to a video file, you would lose all of your rendering progress. If something should happen while you're rendering to image files, however, you can pick up where you left off because each frame gets saved individually as an image instead of being all strung together in a video. Once you have all of your images saved, you can then string them together into an animation. Another tip would be to optimize your scenes for rendering. The more geometry you have in a scene, the longer it will take to render. If you can, try to be conservative with the amount of polygons you use in a particular scene. Quite often you can get away with keeping background objects low poly and then texturing them in a way that makes them still appear realistic. So for example, if you have an object that is far off in the distance and the viewer doesn't see it as clearly as something that's in the foreground, you might want to consider making that background object low poly. Another tip here would be to remove unnecessary objects. Make sure you're deleting or hiding every object in your scene that is not being viewed by the camera. It may seem obvious to say this, but a lot of time artists like to leave extra objects and elements in their files so they can use it later. However, it's best to just remove these if they're not going to be viewed by the camera. Rendering will take longer if there are more objects in the scene, even if they do not appear on camera. The renderer is influenced by all of the objects, and it will spend time calculating the position, texture, lighting, and so on of all of the objects, even those that are not visible. Okay, it's time for the final quiz. You'll be asked a series of quiz questions. Please answer as best as you can and refer to this video if you need help. Congratulations! You've completed this tutorial. You should now have a basic understanding of 3D lighting, 3D cameras, and 3D rendering tips. Thank you for your participation.